November 8, 1944. A forward command post outside Gibling, France. General Major Heinrich Bronsart von Schellendorf sat in a captured German farmhouse that Third Army's intelligence section had converted into a temporary interrogation facility. He had surrendered 48 hours earlier. His captors were professional, methodical, precise, unhurried. The questions were tactical. The answers he gave were calibrated. But Bronsart von Schellendorf was not focused on the questions. He was focused on what he could see through the farmhouse window. Outside, in the mud of the forward area, an American officer was walking toward the building. Black, wearing captain's bars. Behind him, 2 steps back, walked a white American colonel. The colonel's face was rigid with something that Bronsart von Schellendorf recognized immediately. Not fear, not anger in the combat sense, but the specific, controlled revulsion of a man encountering a situation he considered beneath his dignity. The black captain reached the farmhouse door first. He held it open. The colonel walked through without acknowledgement, without eye contact, without the gesture that officers of equivalent standing exchange as a matter of professional reflex. The colonel did not extend his hand. The captain's expression did not change. And Bronsart von Schellendorf thought, they are fighting the same war on different sides of the same line. What he did not know, could not know, was that someone had already noticed, and that someone was George Patton. By November 1944, the 761st Tank Battalion had been attached to Third Army for 6 days. They had entered combat on November 8, 1944, near Gibling, France, making them the first black armored unit committed to combat in American military history. Their attachment to Third Army was not accidental. It was the result of months of command-level negotiation, institutional resistance, and the accumulated pressure of a war that was consuming manpower faster than the Army's racial segregation policies could manage without visible damage to operational effectiveness. Patton had requested the 761st. He had made the request through channels that required him to navigate a War Department bureaucracy that had spent 2 decades constructing a segregated military structure and was not enthusiastic about the precedents that combat attachment of black armored units might establish. Patton had navigated it anyway, because he needed tanks and crews, and the 761st had both. And the arithmetic of combat does not adjust itself to accommodate the preferences of institutions. The German intelligence picture of this development was, by November 1944, more complete than most American commanders would have found comfortable. OKW's Psychological Operations Section, Abteilung Propaganda, had been monitoring American racial policy and its military implications since 1942. Their assessments, compiled in a series of internal reports designated Feindlagebeurteilung Amerika, tracked the deployment patterns of black American units with specific attention to the gap between stated American war aims and the treatment of black soldiers within the American military system. These reports were not uniformly accurate, but they were not uniformly wrong either. And in November 1944, the specific situation unfolding outside Gebling, a black armored battalion in combat, operating within an army whose internal racial hierarchy had not dissolved simply because the shooting had started, provided the German analysts with material that required no embellishment. The colonel whose behavior Bronsart von Schellendorf had observed through the farmhouse window was not, in the context of the American Army of 1944, behaving anomalously. He was behaving in precise conformity with the social architecture of the institution in which he served, an institution that had formally segregated its units since the end of the Civil War, that had spent the interwar period constructing elaborate theoretical justifications for that segregation, and that had entered the Second World War carrying those justifications intact into a conflict being fought, officially, against a regime whose defining characteristic was racial hierarchy. The colonel's refusal to extend his hand to the black captain was not a personal aberration. It was institutional policy expressed through a personal gesture. That is what made it difficult. Personal aberrations can be addressed through individual discipline. Institutional policy expressed through personal gesture requires something more precise and more public. Patton had known about the systemic problem since before the 761st's attachment. He had encountered it at every level of his command, in awards processing, in promotion recommendations, in the assignment of black officers to command positions, in the daily texture of interactions between white and black soldiers that his Inspector General staff documented with increasing frequency through the autumn of 1944. He had addressed it in pieces, through command orders and staff directives and personal interventions that moved the needle without transforming the underlying structure, because the underlying structure was beyond his unilateral authority to transform. What was within his authority was the specific incident, the specific moment, the specific colonel who had walked through a door held open by a black captain and had not extended his hand. That was a solvable problem. And Patton solved it in a way that none of the people present that day forgot for the rest of their lives. The incident has been reconstructed from 4 independent sources. The first is the testimony of Captain David J. Williams, the 761st Tank Battalion's liaison officer, who was present at the forward command post on November 8, 1944, and documented the events in the battalion's unit history, compiled between 1945 and 1947. The second is the account of Major Thomas B. Hooper, 3rd Army's Assistant Inspector General, who witnessed the subsequent confrontation between Patton and the colonel and recorded it in his personal diary entry for November 9, 1944. The third is a letter written by Sergeant Major James Lattimore of the 761st to his brother in Baltimore, dated November 14, 1944, preserved in the Lattimore family collection and donated to the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2009. The fourth is the after-action interview given by the captain himself, identified in Williams's unit history as Captain Marcus Holloway, the 761st's senior intelligence officer, to a War Department historical officer in April 1945. These 4 accounts are consistent in their essential structure and illuminate different aspects of the same sequence of events. Patton had not witnessed the doorway incident directly. He had been informed of it by Major Hooper, who had observed it and whose specific mandate as Assistant Inspector General was to report command climate issues to Patton's staff. Hooper's report reached Patton that evening, November 8, 1944. Patton's response was immediate. He summoned the colonel to his forward command post the following morning, November 9, 1944. The colonel arrived at 0800 hours. What happened in the next 20 minutes is documented in Hooper's diary with a specificity that suggests he understood, as the events unfolded, that he was witnessing something worth recording precisely. Patton did not raise his voice. This detail appears in multiple accounts and is consistent with what is known about his operational temperament when dealing with command failures. He reserved theatrical anger for public occasions designed to motivate. For private corrections of command judgment, he preferred a flatness that witnesses consistently described as more disturbing than any volume he might have achieved. He spoke to the colonel for approximately 17 minutes. The substance, rendered here from Hooper's diary and cross-referenced with the other accounts, was this. He told the colonel that the 761st Tank Battalion had entered combat the previous day. He told him that Captain Holloway had held a door open for him. He told him that Holloway wore the same uniform, carried the same commission, served the same army, and was doing so in a combat zone where the distinction the colonel had expressed through his behavior had no operational value and every operational cost. He then told him something that all 4 accounts render with sufficient consistency to treat as substantially accurate. He said, "In my army, an officer is an officer. The hand goes out or the bars come off." He then told the colonel that if a second incident of this kind was reported from any unit under his command, the matter would proceed through the Inspector General's formal process, which would result in a documented finding in the colonel's permanent record. He then dismissed him. The colonel extended his hand to Captain Holloway that same afternoon. Hooper documented this in his diary. He noted that the handshake lasted approximately 2 seconds and that neither man spoke. He also noted that it happened. It had not happened the day before, It happened after 20 minutes in a room with Patton. The change was not in the colonel's beliefs. The change was in his behavior. And in a military institution, behavior is the thing that matters operationally, regardless of what generates it. The counterintuitive insight embedded in this episode is precise and worth stating explicitly. Patton, one of the most instinctively hierarchical men in the American Army, a man who enforced rank distinctions with a rigor that his own soldiers sometimes found excessive, who believed in the authority of command so deeply that he wore his rank on his helmet in combat, where it made him a sniper's target. That man chose to enforce a standard of treatment that subordinated racial hierarchy to professional hierarchy. Not because he had resolved the ideological question, because he had resolved the operational question. The operational question was simple. Could he afford a command climate in which the black officers of an attached combat battalion understood that the institution surrounding them considered their commission functionally inferior to that of white officers of equivalent rank? He had done the arithmetic. The answer was no. The Germans had done the same arithmetic, and their conclusion, documented in the OKW psychological operations assessments that were flowing through German channels in November 1944, was that American racial division was a genuine operational vulnerability, a crack in the institutional foundation that, properly exploited through propaganda and through the treatment of black prisoners, could widen into something that degraded American combat effectiveness in measurable ways. What the German analysts had not factored into their assessment was Patton. Not because they were unaware of him. Their intelligence picture of Patton was extensive and generally accurate, but because the specific move Patton made in that room on November 9, 1944, using command authority to enforce professional equality as an operational requirement, was not a move that German doctrine had a category for. It did not fit the model of an army whose racial hierarchy was institutional, permanent, and non-negotiable. Bronsart von Schellendorf, still in the farmhouse, did not witness the confrontation between Patton and the colonel. He witnessed its result. On November 9, 1944, through the same window through which he had watched the original incident, he saw the colonel walk across the forward area mud toward Captain Holloway. He saw the colonel extend his hand. He saw Holloway take it. He later told a West German historian in a 1963 interview that he had not understood at the time what had produced the change. He said, "One day a door, the next day a handshake. I did not know what happened between them. I only knew that something had." The 761st Tank Battalion's combat record between November 8, 1944 and May 5, 1945, 183 days of continuous engagement, produced a statistical profile that the Army's post-war historical analysis assessed as exceptional by any comparative standard. Their operations during this period included the drive through the Saar region in November and December 1944, the Ardennes counteroffensive response in December 1944 and January 1945, the Rhine crossing operations in March 1945, and the final advance through Germany and Austria in April and May 1945. The unit's documented performance included 34 confirmed tank kills, the capture of 15,818 enemy personnel, and participation in the liberation of the Gunskirchen concentration camp subcamp on May 5, 1945. Their casualty figures, 71 killed in action, 296 wounded, were proportionate to units of comparable size and combat exposure, and their operational objectives were achieved at a rate that Third Army's after-action assessments consistently rated as satisfactory to excellent. Captain Marcus Holloway served with the 761st through the entire 183-day combat period. His performance evaluations, filed quarterly through Third Army's personnel system, were uniformly positive. His intelligence assessments were cited 3 times in Third Army's G2 summaries as examples of accurate and actionable analysis. He was recommended for the Bronze Star in February 1945 for his work during the Ardennes response. The recommendation moved through Third Army's awards processing channel in March 1945 and was approved. He received the decoration in April 1945. On the day he received it, the officer who placed it on his uniform was not the colonel from Gebling. That colonel had been transferred to a rear area assignment in January 1945. His transfer was not directly attributed to the Gebling incident in any official document. In Hooper's diary, however, the entry for January 14, 1945, notes the transfer with a single additional observation. The hand goes out, or the bars come off. The bars are off. The German intelligence assessment of the 761st's combat performance, compiled by Army Group G's intelligence section in December 1944, after the battalion's first 6 weeks of combat, described the unit in terms that the assessment's authors clearly found professionally uncomfortable. The document, recovered from the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv at Freiburg and translated for the Army's official history project, noted that the American armored unit encountered near Giebling and subsequently in the Saar region had demonstrated tactical aggression and unit cohesion above the baseline for American armor in this sector. The assessment attempted to attribute this to specific equipment advantages and concluded that the analysis was inconclusive. What the German analysts did not know, could not know, was that the unit they were describing had entered combat under a command structure that had, 6 days earlier, been told by the Army commander that its officers were officers and would be treated as such. The correlation between that instruction and the performance that German analysts found exceptional is not provable in the strict evidentiary sense. But the sequence is documented, and the sequence matters. The evidence that Patton's intervention on November 9, 1944, produced consequences beyond the immediate moment takes 3 distinct forms. The first is the awards record. The Bronze Star, awarded to Captain Holloway in April 1945, was the direct product of an awards processing system that had been explicitly required by Patton's January 1945 directive to process recommendations based on documented performance rather than the systemic under-recommendation that his Inspector General had identified across Third Army units with significant black officer populations. Holloway's Bronze Star moved through the system in 5 weeks, a processing time consistent with Third Army's overall standard for non-combat decorations. Before Patton's January directive, the processing time for comparable recommendations involving black officers had averaged 11 weeks. The 5-week processing time was not a gift. It was a correction to a standard that should have applied from the beginning. The second form of evidence is the command climate record. Hooper's Inspector General logs for November 1944 through April 1945, a period covering the entirety of the 761st's combat attachment to Third Army, document a total of 4 command climate incidents involving the treatment of black officers within Third Army's zone of operations. 4 incidents in 6 months, across a command of approximately 250,000 personnel and thousands of daily officer-to-officer interactions, represents a rate that Hooper characterized in his final monthly summary as significantly below the baseline for comparable commands. He attributed this, in the same summary, to command climate established at Army level. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The third form of evidence is post-war and German. Bronsart von Schellendorf, in his 1963 interview, was asked directly whether the incident he had observed through the farmhouse window in November 1944 had changed any of his assessments about the American military. He thought before answering. Then he said, "It told me that their system had people in it who could correct it. Ours did not. That is not a small difference." He paused. Then, the hand on the first day, the handshake on the second. Whoever made that happen, I did not know his name then. I know it now. Staff Sergeant James Lattimore, in his November 14, 1944 letter to his brother, described what had happened in the forward area outside Giebling with the compressed precision of a man who understood that letters home from combat zones needed to be both true and brief. He wrote, "The general heard about it. He fixed it. That's all you need to know about this army right now. He then wrote something that his brother kept, that his brother's children kept after him, and that eventually became part of the Smithsonian collection alongside the letter itself. He wrote, "A man fixed something he didn't have to fix because he decided it mattered." That is the whole story. Lattimore was right that it was the whole story. But the whole story has an analytic dimension that his letter, appropriately, did not pursue. Patton fixed the incident because he had decided it mattered. He had decided it mattered not because he had undergone a moral transformation, not because he was operating from ideological conviction, but because he had applied his commander's arithmetic to a situation that the institution around him was treating as a fixed condition, and had concluded that fixed conditions with operational costs are not actually fixed. They are simply uncorrected. The colonel's behavior was not fixed. It was a correctable failure of command judgment. Patton corrected it in 17 minutes, with a flat voice and a clear statement of consequence. The principle that November 9th, 1944 distills into is not about race, though race is the specific medium through which it operated in that farmhouse in Giebling. It is about the relationship between institutional inertia and individual authority. Institutions produce behaviors that individual authority can either ratify or reject. Patton rejected the colonel's behavior. He rejected it specifically, immediately, and with a consequence attached, because he understood that a rejection without a consequence is a statement, and a rejection with a consequence is a policy. He made it a policy. And policy, unlike statement, persists past the moment of its making. The counterintuitive principle that this episode delivers to every organization that has ever allowed an institutional prejudice to operate unchallenged inside a system that officially opposes it, the gap between official position and actual behavior is not closed by official position. It is closed by the person with authority, who decides on a specific day in a specific room that the gap is operationally unacceptable and attaches a consequence to its continuation. Patton decided that on November 9th, 1944. The decision took 17 minutes. Its effects ran for 6 months through the awards logs, the command climate reports, the inspector general summaries, and the combat record of a battalion that performed at a level that German analysts found exceptional and could not explain. They could not explain it because they could not see into that room. The room is in the record now. The hand goes out or the bars come off. That is the whole principle, in 11 words.